All right, let me give you a little bit of my background. My connection to this topic started decades ago when I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I happened to be working with some women who had come to me with unwanted same-sex attraction. And so that's when I started getting interested in the topic and started looking at it and kind of expanding my own view, and I've been doing that ever since. Right now, I'm conducting 2 clinical studies on the topic, longitudinal, and it's kind of a living and breathing thing for me. I always warn people when I'm giving this particular talk that it's a little bit different perspective than maybe what you were expecting or what you've heard. So bear with me. Hopefully at the end, it will really come to the place where you get where I'm coming from. So, switch it to my microphone. Thank you. All right. So here, I'm very teacher-y. So here are the objectives. By the end of today, I really want you to be able to just know more about sexual attraction and more about sexual orientation, and then consider some of the possible responses from a Christian biblical worldview. There are so many ways to respond, it just depends on the situation, but I'm going to give you some alternatives that might be helpful, hopefully. I really think that helpful responses are built on a clear understanding of attraction and orientation, so I will probably spend most of my time with that piece of it. And then you have lots of biblical scholars around here that can help you with the other piece of it after I'm gone. So here's some of my guiding premises. When I'm thinking about this, talking about this, there are some guidelines that I use to understand it better. The first one is that sexual orientation, as opposed to sexual attraction, sexual orientation, sexual identity, if you will, is a cultural story. Some people call it social construction. I like the term cultural story because every culture has stories that get told and retold and built on until they become kind of have a life of their own. And sexual orientation is just one of those kinds of stories. The term sexual orientation has only existed for 150 years about that. It's a new concept. Previously, and I'll probably repeat this as we go, but previously the idea of homosexuality was talking about behavior and maybe attractions as well, but there wasn't an identity or this idea that some people or that any of us have a sexual orientation. That idea that we have a sexual orientation is a new thought. Sexual attraction is not sexual orientation, 2 different things. I already said that, I'm going to say it probably a lot because that's one of the key things to understanding this. They're 2 separate things, and we're going to be talking about that more as we go. Sexual attractions are fluid. Research has demonstrated this time and time again, but this idea that attractions change is a controversial idea because it's not politically expedient for a lot of people. But if we don't understand that sexual attractions are fluid, we're not going to be able to talk about this rightly or even respond rightly. So, and I'm going to give you some examples of that too as we go of how we know that sexual attractions change. Here's something that I also like to talk about a lot. There's certain, I talk about this a lot. My friends, I don't know how they stand me, but anyway, same-sex attraction is not temptation. We always think that people who have same-sex attraction must have some greater temptation than the rest of us around sexuality. No, it's not temptation in and of itself. It's just that. It's just an experience. It's not sin. Unless you're tempted and you sin, it's not temptation and sin. Sexual attraction doesn't mean that you are tempted with it. There are people who go through an entire day with same-sex attraction and never get tempted once. Just like opposite-sex attracted people can go through an entire day and not get tempted once? Can opposite sex attracted people get tempted? Yeah. And so can same-sex attracted people. So I always caution people, don't leap to the assumption that someone who has same-sex attraction is like fraught with this huge temptation all the time. There are some other challenges for people, and we'll look at that, and we need to be compassionate, but don't jump to the conclusion that they are automatically tempted to sin at all times. So here's the, like I said, I'm going to go on and on about this. Sexual orientation does not exist outside of this cultural story. This cultural story contains this concept of sexual orientation. So here's a bunch of labels thrown up there. I won't go over each and every one of them. But these are kinds of labels that we see thrown around a lot, and I think it's worth just briefly talking about them. The top two are what I'm talking about in terms of what I deal with every day, what I help people with, this does exist. Same-sex attraction and opposite-sex attraction, that exists. Outside of the cultural story, it exists since the fall of mankind. And opposite-sex attraction, maybe even before the fall. I don't know what it was like for Adam and Eve before the fall, but but sexual attraction has always been around. It's something that it just is. But homosexual orientation, heterosexual orientation, homosexual identity, heterosexual identity, the LGBTQ culture, and this idea of ex-gay, all of these are new labels that we have created in the last few years. These labels weren't there before. So we're going to look at maybe some of these, deconstructing some of these labels and getting a better handle on what is empirically verifiable. Same-sex attraction on a continuum and opposite-sex attraction on a continuum are two experiences that do exist. I don't like all the other labels. I don't remember, John Bradshaw, that's who it was, said labeling is disabling. I don't know if that's always true, but I think on this topic, when we label people, we do it for a purpose. And it's to understand them, that's the nicest purpose, but it's also to help us feel more comfortable when we're around them. And we jump to labels all the time. Adolescents are very prone to do this because they're trying to figure out their own identity, and so they're trying to figure out everybody else's identity, and so it's just something that happens all the time. And I find it to not be very helpful to start putting people in boxes. And so that's one of the things that we really work at avoiding when we talk about this. But this, oh, by the way, on a continuum, what I mean by that, when we're measuring same-sex attraction and opposite-sex attraction, which, by the way, we're doing that in my research, it's been done for years, but the continuum piece is relatively new. They used to see people as either or, and it's just not true. People who are same-sex attracted will have also some experiences of opposite-sex attraction throughout their lifetimes. So what we want to do when we're measuring this, we go, okay, do you experience same-sex behaviors, thoughts, feelings, desires? We have different categories. Frequently, sometimes, almost never, that's what we mean by a continuum. Because there are people who experience it rarely, but they experience it. Usually people who have opposite sex attraction only experience opposite sex attraction. So if it's strong on that far end of the continuum. Most people, and we'll look at the statistics today too, but most people only experience it, the opposite sex attraction. But it's still on a continuum because we never know when people might be fluid and influenced toward same-sex attraction for some reason. So we always keep that on a continuum. That's what I mean by the continuum. So here is kind of the little story of how sexual orientation was constructed. Around the 1860s, if you've done any church history or any history really about that period of time, the Judeo-Christian viewpoint, particularly in Western Europe, kind of took a back seat to all kinds of thought. It was rejected, and now this is why we need so many missionaries, Christian missionaries in Western Europe, because it started that far ago, long ago, that there are people who have not even heard about Jesus in that part of the world, in Western Europe. So the Judeo-Christian narrative was rejected, but people, being what they are, always have to have some method to categorize people. They want to know who the right people and the wrong people are, the good people and the bad people are. So if you don't give them a paradigm for that, they'll find one. That's just the way people are. So in stepped this idea of psychopathology. During this period of time, Freud came along. Freud's an easy person to not like, so you'll go with me on this one, I'm sure. Freud came along, and he started developing this idea that these people who came to his office experiencing same-sex attraction were pathological. There was something wrong with them. Inside of them, they, at their core, and this is how Freud saw any kind of problem. It's at your core. And really, what Freud believed is you needed, 6 hours of therapy every week for years, and you had to reconstruct your personality in order to be healthy, and only he could figure out how to do that. These were the outlandish kinds of perspectives that Freud had. But he applied his ideas to people who had same-sex attraction. He saw them as pathological, as something in their essence as wrong. Okay, so that's where the story started. And it's continued. Now, for the first time, sexual identity exists. Right? An identity based on our sexual orientation or our erotic attractions, if you will, exists. An identity of who is part of the individual's essence. Individuals are called gays and lesbians. I just read an article written by a pastor this morning, and he kept talking about these people in his church who were gays and lesbians. That's their identity. I'm challenging that. I don't think that's, that's a narrative that the Bible has about people. So the current state of affairs, for the first time in the history of the world, we have sexual attraction identity, core identity based on erotic feelings. Okay, so just think about that, how weird that is. To me, if you just think outside the box for a second and think about somebody coming from another planet and visiting us and seeing that these people are basing their entire identity on their attractions, their sexual attractions. That's who they are. And then we're asked not only to do that, but to privilege that identity above all others. If the state of the affairs now is in California and New Jersey, if a 17-year-old goes to a counselor and says, I feel attracted to guys. I'm a guy and I feel attracted to guys and I'm really uncomfortable with that. In fact, my Christianity, is at odds with that. And furthermore, I want to someday have kids. I want to have a wife. I may even want to go into ministry. So this doesn't really fit. The law says that therapist can only do one thing, and that is ask him to change his feelings about everything else to be congruent with his current sexual attractions. Privileging the sexual attractions over everything else is now the law in New Jersey and California. They won't say it like that. What they say is it's against the law to try to change those attractions. But what they're actually saying, the opposite end of that, is that you have to privilege those attractions and you have to build a life around that and an identity around that. That's how things are. And it's going to be that way here. And they're going to be that way all over the country, actually. So unless we change this narrative. So heterosexual is kind of funny. So we have a history for homosexual. That word's out there, been there for, it's in the Bible. It's talking about behaviors, not identity though. So Freud actually had to come up with the word for the other end, and he actually made this word up, heterosexual. So that's a really new word, about 150 years old or so. So this is for the normal people. You know, and the original purpose of the construction of this whole idea was to divide the good people, the heterosexuals from the bad people. So they had to have a word for all of these good people, and they came up with it. So, you know, all that is a background to begin to kind of deconstruct this narrative, break it down, take it apart, however you want to talk about it. We have a hard time deconstructing stuff in our culture. Oh, I mean, any culture does. Like, you know, we used to think that the earth was flat. Hard time for people to get over that one. People used to think that the earth was the center of the universe. That was a little bit of the narcissism that people have. But, you know, there's all kinds of things that we've figured out over the years that just aren't true. And it's hard to do that. So this idea of challenging that people don't have a sexual orientation within them is one of those things that's hard to challenge. So I'm going to give you some tools for challenging that, or some information that challenges that. And that's what I mean by deconstructing. The Williams Institute is an organization out of UCLA Law School. They are a very well thought of academic research organization with the whole mission to increase LGBT rights through research. So, in 2011 or so, after the last census, they did this research on using the census to find out how many people in America were actually identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and how many were transgendered. And this is what they found. So 1.8% of the American population is LGBT identified, and 0.03% is transgender. Well, they were not very popular with their constituents. They got in a lot of trouble when they published this, but I really respect them because they published it. They go, okay, this is what we're finding. This is what it is. What's funny is that this is the same number that we've had come through the research for years and years and years. So there is kind of a standard now. Usually it's a little more, 2 to 3% is the typical. But let me just ask anybody brave enough, what do you hear? How much of the population do you hear through the media is LGBT? 3%, you've heard that? 10%. That's the number. All the activists, you're listening to good media. But activists who really haven't studied this, but they have an agenda, they'll say 10%. They'll go into high schools or even grade schools now and say 1 in 10 of you are gay. And that's part of the story. That's what keeps the story alive. It is what it is. Okay, so here's another question that gets asked a lot. The man on the street, I've seen stuff like this on that kind of media. Is homosexuality chosen, or are people born that way? So first thing I always ask my students is, what's wrong with this question? Anybody want to take a guess at what's wrong with the question?
There's no right answer. Either one of those are correct.
Right. Exactly. It sets us up. It's a red herring. It sends us away on a trail of discussing something that is not either, no answer is right. But this is the question that people try to push you into. If anybody ever asks you this question, you don't have to have this conversation. You can say either one. That's the right answer to this question. So what do we mean by biology anyway? So I'm going to give you kind of the overview of that, and then we're actually going to use what we know from genetics specifically to understand more about how we know that sexual orientation is just a cultural story. So when we talk about biology, we're talking about genetics, and that tends to be the thing that people are most bent on finding out, because if it's in our DNA, then we've got a case for something. And then when we talk about biology, we also talk about brain wiring and brain structure, and there's been some research that has been done, and I could go into some details about that, to try to discover whether there is a different brain structure and brain wiring for people who experience same-sex attractions, and so far there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of the genetics either. And then there are hormone studies. You know, one of the theories was that something happens in utero hormonally that makes people become born with certain sexual attractions. So, you know, all of that's been done. And by the way, I always make this little note: the brain wiring and the hormones and the brain structure can be altered by the environment, so it's really hard to do a pure. And there are some people who believe that possibly genetics can be altered. There's no evidence for that yet, but there are people looking for that. It's okay. So here's what the APA has concluded, and I agree with them. In summary, what they're saying, I'll let you read that, but I'll summarize it for you. They say we don't know how sexual orientation occurs. We don't know. And I'm going to be giving you some statistics, just a few, that are compiled by this guy named Neil Whitehead. If you want to know more about the statistics, I should tell you right now, Neil Whitehead is the person to look at. He's actually made his book, My Genes Made Me Do It, public domain, so anybody can look up. He's just compiled all kinds of the research into one place, and then he's made it helps you understand more about it. But anyway, what the APA is saying is we don't know. We have no idea. All this research has been done, and we don't know why some people have same-sex attraction. They call it an orientation, but I call it attractions. And why some people have opposite-sex attractions. We don't know. So attempts to demonstrate that it's biological have all been unsuccessful. There's been no successful attempt in the research. You'll hear different things about that, because what the media does is they try to sell their wares, right? So they'll try to sensationalize anything, but what they say in their reports is kind of the opposite of what the researchers say. The researchers admit this. Even the gay activist researchers who have the money to do the research. Here's an example in regards to the genetics. Twin studies have ruled out genetic determinism. The most rigorous studies that have been done with identical twins, with identical genes, identical DNA, they found about 11 to 15% concordant, which means if one person is gay identified, or homosexual, or whatever they want to label themselves, there's only 11 to 15% chance that their twin will be. So even when this one is where they've controlled for environment. So these are twins that haven't been raised together. So that kind of takes that out of it, but still 11 to 15%. So in general, of what the research on other areas shows is there's a 10% chance that I'm going to be like a bunch of people on any thing that you might measure for me. So you can measure my level of optimism. There's a 10% chance that my friend or somebody across the room is going to be the same as me. So in other words, this is meaningless. If it were genetic, it would be 100%. So you get that? So if it's genetic, then one twin will have it, and so will the other twin all the time, 100% of the time. It's genetic. So that's been really shot out of the water in terms of an explanation. Also, I don't know if you've heard of the Human Genome Project, but the director of that project, Francis Collins, has made a statement that a complete scan of the human genome has determined that there are no gay genes. Also, there is no theory, even if we found that there was a gay gene, there's no theory that says that our gene structure and function can dictate any feelings or behaviors or thoughts. So even if we found it, and it won't happen, and it doesn't make any sense that there would be such a thing. But even if it was there, there's no theory that says, oh, because it's there, therefore you have no control over your feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. There's no theory that says that about anything. Okay, so that's another way we can break this down. So if you're into evolution, natural selection also opposes exclusive SSA. And if you think about it, if it were genetic, it would have bred itself out generations ago. It would not exist. If it's genetic, because people who are same-sex attracted can't produce children sexually, so they would not exist anymore. So that's another simple way of deconstructing this whole argument that it's genetic. So we've done a kind of a quick review of some of the ways of breaking this all down, and I'm going to move on to how do we respond then. There's a lot more information out there on breaking this down from a social perspective. Like anthropologists have written about this to break down this whole idea and to help us to know. There are some cultures where there is no homosexual behavior, period, in the entire group of people. And then there are some where it's required behavior as part of their initiation rites. But none of those people create an identity afterwards. They just move on and have their families and move on with life. So this idea of identity based on our attractions can be broken down from an anthropology perspective too. There are other people who look at it in different ways. So now I think another way to look at it is from the fluidity piece of it. I told you in the beginning that sexual attractions are fluid. And here's some of the research that backs this up. Almost all teenagers experiencing same-sex attraction, according to the research, will change to opposite sex attraction, 98%. Now that, unfortunately, because during adolescence, people are looking for an identity and everybody wants them to get an identity, and now that all of the adults are pushing kids to have an identity around their sexual attractions when they're little children, even, which is kind of weird. I mean, again, there's so much of this that if you think outside of our little cultural story, how bizarre is that we're trying to push little kids into claiming an identity based on sexual attractions that they shouldn't be having yet. Physiologically, they should not be having it yet. But we want them to claim an identity around that. So one of the things that's happening to kids who say, I think I'm gay, or I think I'm lesbian, or the culture is forcing them into claiming that. Otherwise, it's internalized homophobia. They don't claim that. Then they've got another problem if they don't claim that. So either way, And then what we do is we start encouraging them to explore their sexuality. This is alarming to me, that we actually then further sexualize these kids. Lots of times, and I'm going to give you another statistic in a minute, a lot of times the boys who experience same-sex attraction have already had an experience, inappropriate sexual experience. So then we push them into this whole life of sexual thoughts, that they would have not gone to if they weren't born in this culture currently. So the earlier adolescents come out, the more likely that they will experience mental health problems. Actually, there's a really strong correlation between the earlier they come out and suicide. Not just attempts, but actual successful suicide. So why is that? One of it's, some of it's because probably the earlier they come out, maybe the more likely they had some sort of traumatic event. The more there is stigma with it. There's no way I'm going to say that that's not true. A 13-year-old says, I think I'm gay, he's going to get a lot of trouble at school. Even now, even though it's supposed to be very acceptable, it's not. especially amongst 13-year-old boys, because they're all scared that that's going to be true for them too, because most of them don't want to do that. They want to go along and have a family. Some other reasons are probably one of the main reasons, I think, is that the story, when they come out, they walk into the story that we have already written for them in our culture, which is that you are now that. That is who you are, and that's who you will be the rest of your life, and you have no choices. You will have no choices. This is who you are. What 13-year-old wants to believe that about anything about them? They don't want to think that about their occupations. They don't want to think about that for anything, much less their sexual attractions or their sex life. So if you work with adolescents, I always encourage you to delay it. Tell them they don't have to identify with anything. They can be whoever they are. They don't have to be part of a group of people who are going to push them into being a certain way. Sometimes that's what they want. They want someone like them. And so, but maybe to help them find other people like them who don't want to be part of that group that's highly sexualized. Promiscuity is part of the culture. There's no getting around it. And so you may want to help guide them to other people who are experiencing the same things as they are. Who refuse to be labeled. I think that's a great thing to do with adolescents. Is helping. And I worked with a lot of young women, teenagers and young women, who came in and said, I don't want to be a lesbian. I mean, I've been in this same-sex relationship for 2 years, but I don't want to be called a lesbian. I don't want this to be my whole life. And okay, good. Let's not do that then. You don't have to carry that mantle that the culture is. You're carrying it for the culture. And all those people who need you to carry it for them, that this is who you are. You don't have to carry that. Let it go. And let's just see what happens. That who I am narrative is a really big part of the problem, I think. Most changes in sexual attraction, again, it's fluid, right? But most changes happen toward exclusive opposite sex attraction. So while I'm saying, yeah, sexuality is fluid, people change. They almost always change toward opposite sex attraction. So it's not all that strange for teenagers to have a same-sex attractive experience, especially now in our culture, because they're encouraged to experiment and they're encouraged to think outside that box. And if they have a close relationship with somebody of the same sex, they automatically start questioning themselves. I was just talking about this with this friend of mine who is even older than me. And she said, I remember when we were kids, teenagers, we could walk down the hall, girlfriends, holding hands, and nobody thought anything of it. They didn't label us as lesbians. And in many countries, you can see that now, still too, but you never know anymore. But in boys, I think about David and Jonathan's relationship in the Bible. Look at them. I mean, they were tight. They were tight young men. They were encouragers. They were really close. But we're not allowed to have that now, because if a young man is that close to another young man, they're told, oh, you must be gay. And from a clinical perspective, one of the things that sets people up for developing same-sex attractions, and I'm saying this in my experience, is that somehow they didn't get that close connection with somebody of the same sex. Somehow that didn't happen for them. This is not true for everyone, but this is one of the things that we see pretty commonly. And part of what's keeping that from happening now is this whole idea that if you do have closeness in a good way, then that means you're probably going to be gay. And so it's just like a vicious cycle right now. Right now, ex-gays outnumber current identified gays. I mean, I tell you that my friends that are ex-gay, I don't like that term, but I get why they use it, because they used to be gay identified. They used to be part of that, and that's no longer their identity. So they call themselves ex-gays. And people hate them. They get hate mail, especially if they're in the public eye. Both sides, everyone hates them. It's just kind of crazy. So if you know any people who are ex-gay identified, please support them, because they need help from friends. More change happens. About half of individuals, so this is say over a lifetime. There are virtually no adults who have been exclusively, who have had no opposite sex attraction behavior or thoughts or feelings, who have had exclusive SSA throughout their lifetime.
That's a good question. So when you say ex-gays that no longer identify themselves that way, does that mean they don't have the same sex attraction any longer, or they're not living with that same sex attraction, and now they're opposite sex attracted? Or are they
All of the above. All of the above. Some people who are ex-gays, no longer, they're like these half of the population, who no longer have the same-sex attractions. Some of them still have lots of same-sex attraction. Some of them have, they're somewhere in the middle.
So they're just not calling themselves.
They're no longer identifying them, saying that their erotic attractions are their essence. Yeah.
So they may still have the same sex attraction.
Absolutely.
But they're not identifying themselves as that.
Right. They're not part of that ex-gay identity movement. I mean, that gay identity movement. They said that's not who I am. Yeah. But they can manifest all kinds of ways. But my friends are the ones that I'm around a lot are either completely opposite sex attracted or mostly opposite sex attracted. It's a good question. I'll have time for more questions too. So again, here's some of my little ideas about to keep in mind as we're considering how to respond. Attraction is not sin. Okay, that's a pretty easy one. We get that. Attraction is not temptation. That's a harder one, and I said that in the beginning. Same-sex attraction in and of itself is not a temptation. If we assume that, again, we're putting that on the person. It may not belong to them. So don't jump to that conclusion that they're already tempted. It also carries a stigma that does not accompany other experiences common to the general population. So here's some things that I think are important to think about before we respond at all. First of all, don't assume that they're struggling with temptation right now. They might be, but don't make that assumption. Don't assume they're sinning, but also recognize that there's a stigma around just that having that same-sex attraction, and that there aren't that many people who have that experience. If there is temptation or sin, this is kind of, I don't want to step on anybody's toes with this, but approaching it like any other temptation or sin is well-meaning but insensitive. I believe we do that because we want to say, hey, the ground is all level at the foot of the cross, right? We're all at the same place. That's why we do it. But here's the problem with it. It's not common. Though that person having that temptation or in that sin may not know that many people. It doesn't seem normal to them. They don't feel normal. And for you to say, oh, you're just like you're everybody else, so they don't feel that way. They don't feel it that normal. And it's also accompanied by stigma and pain. Whereas opposite sex attraction or temptation, there's not stigma with that. It's what we consider normal. We expect people to have that. It's okay if they're tempted, just as long as they don't sin, right? So, but that's not true for same-sex attraction. Let me give you one of my examples I like to use to kind of bring this home. If you have a 20-year-old daughter and she's dating Josh, so she comes to you and she says, Mom and Dad, I want your accountability, I want your help. Josh and I are really feeling tempted to have sex. You're like, okay. You're actually kind of proud of her because she's come and gotten accountability and she's owned it. And let's say she comes to you and says, yeah, Mom, Dad, Brittany and I really want to have sex. Okay. You're like, oh, wow. I mean, it's going to be a completely different response because it's not the same. It's not the same. There's more to it than just temptation. There are other things going on, if nothing but a lot of stigma and a lot of pain and a lot of rejection and a lot of confusion So just to sweep it into this, I know it's well-meaning, but we may skip over the pain if we just say it's like every other sin. That's what my concern is. I don't want to skip over the pain. So here's something that I always tell my students. First of all, why do you think you should respond at all? And you may have 5,000 really great reasons. I just want you to think of it. What are you responding to? Are you responding out of your own fear? Are you responding out of your love for them? Are you responding, who are you responding to? Just sit back and think and pray. Ask for wisdom about how to respond before you respond. So we're going to move on to some of the things to keep in mind when you are responding. I've talked about this a little bit. There's a high correlation with same-sex attraction, not necessarily orientation, identity, or any of that, just the attraction. High correlation with depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. So this is why I'm saying, don't assume that it's just like any other temptation. There's some other stuff going on with this, oftentimes. Males are more likely to be involved in sexually risky behavior. So, that's true for men no matter what, than women. But for males who are same-sex attracted, that's kind of part of the culture. Okay? The risky, kind of crazy kind of stuff, and they get caught up in that. So they may have had those experiences, which can lead to some trauma, some assault, sexual assaults. A lot of men have experienced sexual assaults as adults. Childhood sexual abuse. 46% of gay identified men report, that's my shorthand history of sexual abuse versus 7% of non-gay identified men. Okay? So just keep this in mind. This person is much more likely to have some real wounding that maybe he hasn't ever been able to talk about, because men have a huge stigma against talking about this. Women can go and tell somebody that they've been sexually abused. Men, they may not even let themselves know. They may not even identify that thing that happened to them as sexual abuse. Same thing with women, but men even more so. Men aren't supposed to let that happen to them. That's the rule in our society. Men shouldn't let that happen to them. They should always be the most strong, so they may not have told anybody. Lesbian identified women are not as high, but they do still have a higher than non-lesbian identified women in terms of childhood sexual abuse. And then there's that high risk for suicide. Be aware of that, with adolescents particularly. Always with unconditional love, compassion, of course. If that's your theme, you're going to be okay. You can't go wrong. If you really get it, that they are in this world, that they've been deceived by this story. You've been deceived by this story, I'm guessing. Most people have been deceived by this story on some level. I have been. I'm only I was deceived by this story in my younger years before I started doing this. That people just can't help it, or whatever, that they're stuck in this story for the rest of their lives. That's the part of the story that we get deceived by. So, how do we respond to sinners? I'm actually going to try to read this whole passage from Matthew 9:11 through 15. This is I'll just read it and we'll figure out where I am. Jesus left there. I'm sorry, I can't remember what translation this is. I was not a good scholar, but not citing the translation. Jesus left there, and as he passed on, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at his desk in the tax collector's office. "Follow me," he said to him, and the man got to his feet and followed him. Later, as Jesus was in the house sitting at the dinner table, a good many tax collectors and other disreputable people came on the scene and joined him and his disciples. The Pharisees noticed this and said to the disciples, "Why does your master have his meals with tax collectors and sinners?" But Jesus heard this and replied, It is not the fit and the flourishing who need the doctor, but those who are ill. Suppose you go away and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. In any case, I did not come to invite the righteous, but the sinners. So this is kind of my thought when we're dealing with sinners and seekers. I never tell people, unless they ask me, what I think about this. in terms, I'm telling you right now, no, I mean like when people come to me and confront me, and and I do have people who do that, who find out what I do and kind of the organizations I'm around, and they ask me right out, I'll tell them. But the people who I know who are in this culture, I wait until they ask me. And typically, I'm able to tell them, and I've never had any one of my friends reject me when I tell them what I believe and why I believe it. Because they were my friends first. They knew me. So I think that makes a difference. They knew I loved them. And in fact, one of my friends goes, well, how come you love me still? I'm like, because I love you. I love you, So that's kind of my little guide for dealing with sinners and seekers. Just hang out with them, be their friends. That's what Jesus did. Now, if you're struggling with same-sex attraction and you're trying to deal with that yourself, I wouldn't recommend that you go hang out with guys who are really promiscuous and part of that lifestyle. It's not a good idea. But, use wisdom and get this one. Okay, so this is for believers that may be confused. And I don't mean people struggling with this only. I mean people who are believers and are confused by the culture story. I love this passage for helping us to kind of get what's going on. And I'm going to read this one out loud too. It's from Ephesians 4:17-24. This is my instruction then, which I give you from God. Do not live any longer as the Gentiles live, for they live blindfold in a world of illusion and cut off from the life of God through ignorance and insensitiveness. They have stifled their consciences and then surrendered themselves to sensuality, practicing any form of impurity which lust can suggest. But you have learned nothing like that from God. If you have really heard his voice and understood the truth that he has taught you. No, what you learned was to fling the dirty clothes of the old ways of living, which were rotted through and through with lust's illusions, and then with yourselves mentally and spiritually remade to put on the clean, fresh clothes of the new life which God has made by God's design for righteousness and of holiness, which is no illusion. So, the reason I like that is because it confronts us to recognize that the story that says that these people have no choice but to have sexual identity based on, or an identity based on their sexual attractions. That's not a story that's congruent with what God has for them. He wants their identity to be based on their relationship with him. And all others go down below that. That's clear. And so kind of the story that I hear being told now in evangelical circles that, oh, these people can't help it, I think it's very condescending. Why is it that they can't help their feelings, thoughts, and behaviors? It's like saying there's something, that they're a different kind of being. I can be responsible for my feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, but you can't. It's really kind of what we call benevolent prejudice in the sociology world. This idea that I'm prejudiced in a good way because I'm being nice to you, but it's really condescending. So this whole story that there's people who have no control over their feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and they should build an identity around that, therefore, it's a lie. And I feel pretty strongly about that. I think I actually call it pseudo-compassion, because compassion can't be found outside of truth. And anytime that we do compassion that is separate from the truth of the word, then it's not real compassion. And I feel pretty strongly about that too. Remember that they don't have less personal power over their feelings, thoughts, and behaviors than you do. However, they may very well be deceived by the story that the world has to the point of not even knowing that. So for you to just hammer them with that, it's not going to be helpful. Just know that. Just know that. Know this, that they don't know yet about themselves. They don't know this about themselves yet, but you can know that for them and carry it with them and be with them in that and talk to them about everything else but that in that way. And then see what God does, how He leads you to ministering to them. So any questions?
Carolyn, you said earlier at California, New Jersey, there's a law that requires someone or some institution. What is the context? What is the institution or the organization that's affected by that law that requires that privilege?
Well, let me clarify. State of California, state of New Jersey have passed laws that do not allow anybody to receive professional services by psychiatrists, psychologists, marriage and family therapists, social workers or counselors or anybody to change their unwanted same-sex attractions if they're teenagers. So I don't know what they're supposed to do.
I'm getting, and I may be making a big jump based on this California, New Jersey thing, that homosexuality could be cured.
If you think it's an illness, I don't think it's an
Well,
illness.
and that's just it. Can sin be cured? Is it behavior?
It's not,
That's what
it's
I've
not
said.
sin.
Yeah, what,
Same-sex attraction is not sin.
yeah, but the act is.
Sure.
Okay.
Those are
that's
two
why
different
I've
things.
always-
You know, people don't come to me because they're concerned about their behavior being sinful. Because that's already a thing that's happening.
Right.
They're concerned about, I'm stuck with this same-sex attraction, and I don't want it.
Well, that's why
That's what we're
I've
talking
always
about.
said-
We're not talking about the behavior.
Yeah, I love homosexuals. I hate homosexuality. There is a difference in being and doing the action. Am I bad?
Well, you're assuming that there are homosexuals. That's kind of what I'm like. My thing is there are no homosexuals. There are people who the culture has put them in that box. But there are people with the same-sex attraction, but that's
Then
different.
why is it even mentioned in the Bible that they're homosexuals?
They're talking about their behavior. If you break it down, it's
Right.
talking about
That's
behavior
exactly-
as opposed to an identity.
Yeah, that's exactly my point.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? All right, you know what, I'll just hang out up here, down here, not up here, down there, and if you have any questions, feel free, I'll come up and talk to you about them afterwards. Thanks for your time and for listening.